I'm Will Richmond, and I'm from VideoNuze. And the most important announcement is that you're only eligible to win the Apple Watch if you're actually sitting down. Okay, that's the deal. And this is an edition, watch edition. Okay, this is not the sport level. All right, so this is $15,000 we're talking about. So let's come grab a seat. All right. Okay. So we're going to talk about viewability tonight. Just a tiny little issue in the industry, and I'm going to ask Aniq and Neeraj to first introduce yourselves.
So my name is Aniq Rahman. I'm the president of a company called Moat. We're an online advertising, analytics, and intelligence company. We're proudly based in New York, but work with clients all over the world. We started Moat about 5 years ago, and our vision was really around to make brand advertising more effective on the web. So in the evolution of that, we've been measuring display, video, mobile, native and sponsored content, and we're excited to be starting to do some stuff in OTT as well.
All right.
Neeraj Kochhar. I'm the managing director of buy-side platforms at Tremor Video. What I mean buy-side platforms, that encompasses the demand-side platform, ad serving and analytics for video investments. At a high level, Tremor Video has been in the video space for about 10 years now. We're a premium marketplace focused on video. We have solutions that encompass supply-side solutions, an SSP, a DSP, as well as managed solutions. So we represent the full spectrum of solutions in the marketplace around video, premium video.
Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Let's just make sure that we're all talking about the same thing, first of all, which is talking about viewability. What is viewability in video actually mean today? Define what that term actually means. So Aniq, do you want to get started?
Sure, absolutely. So in talking about the evolution of viewability as a term, the concept of viewability is very simple. It's literally, was the ad there? And the evolution of video and viewability sort of goes back to this legacy of viewability and display. People have been talking about viewability. Some people have been talking about it for a decade, but really what happened is at the end of the first quarter of last year, the MRC lifted an advisory that they put around viewability for display, and at the end of the second quarter of last year, they lifted the advisory that they put around for viewability in video. And so the way that the MRC and the IAB and the industry groups have defined viewability is if half or more of an ad is in view and display for 1 second, it's considered viewable. And if half or more of a video is in view for 2 seconds, it's considered viewable. Although there have been some players in the industry that have come up with alternative definitions around viewability. Some of the agencies are, for example, asking for things like 100% of the video to be in view for half the duration of the player. Some are asking for the sound to be on, et cetera. So there are industry accepted terms, but there's also some adjacent terms that have been defined in recent history.
Yeah, that's right. The way that I see the IAB MRC definition is really the opportunity to see. Opportunity to see standard. In video, it gets more interesting because you have the dimensionality of time and duration. How do you capture that beyond the standard metric, which is just the trigger, i.e. the opportunity to see? But how much of the ad was in view, for what duration? Those are also factors that ultimately impact viewability. Cheryl Main, who's very articulate about the thinking behind the IAB, talks very specifically that this is opportunity to see and is not intended to measure the true impact of the video. And I think there are ways, analytics, that do a much better job of capturing the true impact and the ability to score that, given the fact that you could be watching any portion of the ad over the duration of it.
Right, but it is an important starting point, right?
Absolutely.
Because I think what happened, if I recall, about a year or so, maybe a little more ago, there was a big article in, I think, the New York Times that was sort of an expose, if you will, of different buyers who found out that their ads that they thought were being placed in X, Y, or Z positions were in fact placed in A, B, or C positions, not A, B, C, but A, B, or C positions. And those were not where they expected them to be. And not only that, they were not actually viewable by anybody's reasonable definition. So it sort of cast a bit of a cloud over the entire industry that maybe viewability is sort of a bit of a kind of skeleton in the closet that nobody wants to talk about. So are we past that now, do you think, given the advisory and what you were talking about, the MRC?
Yeah, so I think that it's still very, very early days. Some people say that it feels like we're driving on the Autobahn, but we're building the car and we're laying the track at the same time. So there's a lot of catching up to do in some instances, getting people sort of aligned on what they're measuring, how they're measuring it, what the methodology is. But I think that this is something that will get figured out over time. I also think that viewability really is a starting point. Again, it's answering whether or not the ad was there, whether or not the user had an opportunity to see the ad, but it doesn't necessarily answer the full question. So just because half of a player is in view for 2 seconds doesn't necessarily mean that a user noticed the ad or paid attention to it. And I think that that's really where the industry is headed. So viewability, I think, is a starting point, but I think that the end goal is understanding, was the sound on? Did the user navigate to another tab? Was it viewed by an actual human being rather than a bot or some fraudulent, suspicious activity? There's a whole handful of questions that I think are being asked now. And I think that over time, we're going to have a more holistic view around whether or not users actually paid attention to the ad. And that's really what we've sort of set out to start measuring as well.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. The IAB defined it as a transition year. I think the word that they left out was painful. It's going to be extremely painful. You have multiple vendors. You have different expectations. I think it's a great starting point as a minimum threshold, a baseline for billing for transaction. It hasn't prevented agencies and holding companies from demanding more or measuring or looking at more. So again, I think it's going to play out slowly. We need to make sure that discrepancies are something that are acceptable between multiple vendors. But it's a good starting point.
So you guys both talk about a starting point and other things that need to be done. Let's just focus a little more right now on the starting point and how robust that starting point is, because you've both kind of alluded to the idea that there are certain players in the industry that actually don't kind of fully accept the IAB definition of what viewability actually is today. Does that suggest that there's still another chapter to be played here in terms of actually defining what viewability is, or do you think we're going to kind of stay with the standard that's been set at this point?
Yeah, I think the standard will be a baseline for the numerous players in the industry. There are multiple vendors who will need to mobilize around it in some capacity. However, this is already happening. Group M notably, Chris Magel is here from IPG, and I know they have a perspective on viewability. I think they're demanding, or they have expectations that their publishers provide more than the standard, and that they have vendors who can support that. The capability exists, so I think we'll see a standard that people will try and mobilize around, and then we will see holding companies and agencies structure very custom definitions and requirements around it.
So there could be more stringent requirements for viewability that are kind of market defined on a kind of case-by-case basis. Okay. Yeah. Aniq?
Yeah, I think that there has to be a baseline consistency around how people are measuring. But our view as a company is that we want to measure to multiple different standards because ultimately the marketers and the publishers are going to determine how they're going to make the transaction. That said, I think it is important for us to establish a good baseline so that we can create comparative norms, so we can create benchmarks, so that we can actually figure out what the right metrics are for transaction, for the right marketer, for the right situation. I think that the other thing is we need to create apples-to-apples measurement metrics so that you can look holistically across display, video, mobile, and native advertising, content, OTT, et cetera. Ultimately, I think that we live in a world where, as a consumer, I've got 50 different things that, in my attention stream. So, I've got 10 tabs open in my browser, I've got a smartphone, I've got a tablet, I've got TV. There's no scarcity in the number of impressions that are running out there. There's hundreds of channels on television, for example. The scarcity out there is in consumer attention. And so being able to measure that holistically and being able to, for example, if I'm a consumer and I want to watch, or say I want to search for something, it doesn't really matter to me if I'm searching for it, doing a Google search on my phone or on my tablet or on my computer. But ultimately, it matters how we're tracking that. So say I'm watching a television show. I could be watching it on my phone, and then I could Chromecast it to my television. We think that you should be able to measure that consistently across both of those consumer device experiences. And with the proliferation of Oculus and virtual reality, Apple Watches, all these new devices that are popping up, we have to have a consistency mechanism to look across all these mediums.
Are we going to have that?
That's what we're building toward, yeah, for sure.
Is the market ready to kind of accept, as you said, a kind of a holistic solution across all those different devices?
Yeah, the clients we work with are looking at it across all their media channels, and viewability is one metric that they're looking at across these devices. Historically in the world of digital, if you go back to the first banner ad that ran in 1994, here we are 21 years later, historically the only metrics that we had consistently on every report were clicks and impressions. Yet for brands, no one's buying Poland Spring by clicking on an ad, no one's buying Coca-Cola, no one's buying cars by clicking on ads, no one's buying Subway or Land Rover and all the other marketers that are in the room by clicking on ads. So what we're trying to do is figure out a consistent, holistic way of understanding how consumers pay attention across devices.
Yeah. Let's talk about within video itself just for a second, then we'll
Sure.
come back to holistic. But one of the things that came out of the standard is that there's now a call for vendors to provide what their actual ways of measuring viewability are to first sync up on that. And my understanding is that there's something like 40 or 45 different companies in the industry that say they have some type of a measurement technology. I think about maybe 15 or 20 or so have been MRC accredited at this point. I think both of your companies are MRC accredited. So maybe you guys could just spend a minute talking about how's that going to be reconciled, just the measurement of the standard being synced up before we get to the holistic across different devices. Let's just stay within video for a second. So Neeraj, do you want to start that one?
Honestly, I think that is something that we're going to figure out during the transition year. As an example, as we look at our own methodology, we're now comparing and contrasting that with multiple methodologies from Moat and IAS, just to get a sense of what is the discrepancy. I don't know if there's been any effort in the marketplace to do that across the vendors. So I think from our perspective, as we do that, we're going to look at some numbers. There'll be some findings that'll help us get a sense of what is the average discrepancy across the different players in the market.
So you're sort of describing almost like an organic process where Tremor is saying, is there some effort to kind of coalesce among at least the 15 or so MRC accredited vendors at this point? Or is it more kind of what you were talking about, like, you might look at Moat, but are you looking at, 3 others or 10 others as well?
We're looking at a handful. I would say we're looking at about 5 at this particular point in time. Moat obviously is in there. I'm not aware of any industry-wide effort. Tonight might be a good time to kick it off.
Yeah, so we're working with thousands of marketers and agencies and publishers and technology platforms, and our goal is to really be agnostic. We don't buy media, we don't sell media, we don't serve media. We want to be a trusted third party in the market. And I think for a marketer, it's also important to be able to look at Tremor and compare it to their buys on the networks and look at it across their buys on Hulu and other sites and have a consistent apples-to-apples view across all those buys. They may be getting a viewability number from Tremor, but I think that at the end of the day, they want to have a way to see it across all their platforms.
Is that something that Moat is also interested in doing? Kind of like Neeraj was saying, Tremor's looking to work with, it sounds like a handful of other vendors. Are you guys also now trying to work with other vendors in their measurement, trying to sync things up across different platforms?
Yeah, I mean, we've taken collaborative approaches in the industry, working with groups like the IAB, the ABC in the UK, the MRC in the US, and just making sure that we're all working toward similar methodologies, making sure that we're being honest about the ways that we're measuring and actually being able to deliver that we're measuring in cross-domain iframes, being able to measure across devices, across browsers. And so I think that there's still a bit of catching up to do from certain players, but we've tried to take a very industry-leading perspective on that.
So you, Neeraj, talked about 2015 as the transition year or the year of pain, depending on your perspective.
By the way, I'm not going to be 1 year.
And you anticipated my question perfectly. What is the time frame on all this? Can you guys kind of explain what end of 15, 16 into 17 starts to look like for viewability?
I mean, I think we're already seeing most IOs and most activity come through with certain expectations around viewability. I believe that is going to be the case across the board. every single video campaign in IO will have some clear requirement around viewability.
Yeah.
So I believe by the end of this year, it won't be the exception. It'll be the norm, the standard that comes with everything. So I think everyone's going to incorporate it as a basic standard. I think we'll also begin to see an appreciation of what you can get above and beyond just that basic standard. And what I mean by that is, again, going back to how much of the ad is in view, you can look at things per quartile, and this is available today. So it may not be the billable standard, it may not be the metric that agencies look at in terms of transaction, but it's certainly something that agencies can look at today and use it as a basis of scoring. You know, at each quartile, how much of the video, okay, sorry, microphone went off. Just getting a sense of how much is viewable each quartile, going back to what Aniq said, was the audio turned on or off, was it in the active tab? All of that can be scored to give you a relative score of what was the actual impact in terms of overall attention. And from my perspective, the brand experience starts where viewability ends, in terms of at least the standard of where the viewability ends. Because it's really a trigger, but everything that's interesting or appealing or likely to have a brand impact actually begins where viewability as defined today ends.
And by the way, some of the things you just described, if I understand correctly, are part of what Tremor currently offers. Do you guys feel like you're sort of leading the market, leading the buy side on offering those types of metrics, or conversely, are you getting requests for those and that's why you're providing them?
Well, so I'm somewhat biased here, but we absolutely believe we're taking a leadership position. Okay. And just to give you some quick data, we were accredited and certified by the MRC for 5 viewability metrics in 2013, way before
before viewability was cool.
Absolutely. So it's the former. I feel like we've taken a leadership position. When we talk about viewability, we're really talking about brand performance. Going back to what Aniq said, if you look at brand investment, it isn't about response. It isn't about CTR or CPA. That can be an element of certain types of tactics. But ultimately did the brand message get across? And we're trying to measure that through technology and the use of very deep analytics.
Mm-hmm. Aniq, do you want to talk a little bit about how Moat is approaching, again, stay with video just for a second, not the holistic, but just approaching video and the types of metrics that you're offering as well? And
totally. So, we've been measuring video for a long time as well. In fact, we were the first company that was accredited for both viewability measurement in display and in video. So we sort of got to see across both. But sticking to video, what we've seen so far, as of the most recent quarter, we saw that average viewability as an industry, per the MRC definition, is about 51%. So there's a lot of room for improvement. Like 49% of video ads are still not viewed by consumers. And then also when you look at some of these other metrics, like the Group M definition, we're seeing it's even far lower than that. It's down in the 40s, for example. We're seeing things like completion rate, which is historically how video's been measured as successful. When you look at whether or not the sound was on and whether the video was viewable at completion, that number is something like 23%, 24%. So there's a lot of room for improvement in the industry across these metrics.
You're sharing some pretty eye-opening numbers. I mean, that's, you're talking about half of ads today are not viewable, at least according to the definition, which in my estimation is actually a relatively modest definition.
Correct.
I would argue, it sounds like you would agree. So that, to your point, sounds like there's still a lot of work to go and maybe some more articles yet to be written about, kind of what's going on in the industry.
Totally, and we're seeing that some of the partners that we work with, so for example, we measure all of Hulu's inventory. They actually did a blog post about this recently, but at first they were a little hesitant to start measuring viewability across their site, but as soon as they saw the numbers, Hulu is all above the fold inventory, user initiated, big player. They're seeing their viewability is well into the 90s, 90 percentile on average, and what they're seeing is that marketers are looking to spend more on Hulu because they have such good numbers. So I think that publishers and networks that are really reacting to this and being proactive rather around getting their scores up are going to end up benefiting from this economically because marketers want to spend more there.
Right, that makes sense. By the way, we're open for questions if anybody has. We have about 5-10 minutes left, so feel free just to wave your hand if you want to jump into the conversation.
I have a comment which to add on to what you guys are saying. I think it's a little bit less about, I think if you change the currency to just things that have been viewed, and you eliminate any financial incentive whatsoever for ads that are not viewed, that's how it will change the fastest. Because if financial incentives are all based in the right direction, then the business will take care of itself. That would be the additional. So that's why we shoot, Neeraj mentioned with IPG Media Branch, we do shoot for 100% viewability. We're trying to get that accomplished with all partners by the end of the year. That's because we believe that if you move to the currency as fast as possible of just something that actually had a chance to be seen and not paying for anything else, then that incentivizes everybody to get rid of it.
Right. Agree.
Yeah, I totally agree. And we work really closely with IPG, and I think they've also taken an industry standard setting approach towards viewability measurement, in the sense that if there are publishers that want to transact on viewability and they're using Moat, they will accept that number from the publisher over their own client number. So if their client's using another vendor, they'll just accept the Moat number from the publisher. So I think that's taking the vendor discrepancy conversation off the table. It's making it easier for both sides to transact on viewability.
Other questions or comments from the audience? Yes.
Out of curiosity, we talk about aspirationally 100% viewability, as high as viewability as possible. What's being done to increase what's measurable? I mean, what's trackable? Because that's not 100%. So it's kind of a misnomer.
Great question. So we're actually very transparent about what our measurability rates are. So in display, our measurability rate is about 99%. In video, it's also about 99%. So we actually are pretty close to 100% when it comes to actual measurability. I think I would love to see other vendors be a little bit more transparent around what they can actually measure. What we've seen is that a lot of vendors can't measure in certain browsers. So one vendor in particular recently came out and said that they couldn't measure in Chrome and Safari, which make up about 65% of the browser market. So I think that there's definitely a lot of room for improvement and more transparency in figuring out what people can measure. And then mobile video, people aren't even talking about mobile video. I think a lot of people aren't able to measure mobile period, let alone mobile video, which is another, I think, going to be another huge area of discussion.
Yeah, I mean, we've taken the same approach in terms of transparency. We very specifically carve out what was measurable and what wasn't. I mean, the other thing about measurability is you can measure down to each individual quartile. What we introduced a couple of years ago was the concept of average viewability percentage. So an example, first quartile, 100% in view, and then you scroll down. We're assuming the audio is turned off in this particular case. And then during the fourth quartile, you scroll back up. That calculates the average viewability percentage. If the, and that in turn leads to a score that we're giving every single exposure. So whether the audio is turned on or off, we sort of calculate all of those different variables into one overall score for that exposure. So that level of measurement is available for anything that can be measured. So that's sort of twofold: full transparency in terms of what we can and cannot measure, and then measuring in excruciating detail and delivering that data to the client.
So I think we just have another minute or two left, so let me just ask you guys a last question to wrap up, and hopefully you're both sticking around a little bit if audience has questions afterwards. But tell us, is there an end state for viewability? I mean, is there a point at which we will not be having this discussion? We kind of had one, kind of introducing that idea here, but is that going to be the case at some point, and if so, when?
Yeah, I do think that viewability becomes table stakes in the next year or two, or however long it takes. Sure. But I think it's inevitable that it's going to become table stakes. Everyone's going to have a viewability measurement on every campaign. It's going to be as ubiquitous as clicks, for example, on reports. But I think that the end state is, as Neeraj pointed out earlier, really the beginning of the brand conversation. So moving away from just viewability and also thinking about some of these other metrics, like was the sound on, how long was it in view for? I think time is a huge component that people aren't even talking about. Was an ad viewed for 2 seconds, or was it actually viewed for 20 seconds or 30 seconds? Were you actually making an impression on the user? So I think that the end state is really opening up the conversation towards attention, which we started the discussion with.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's going to need to move to attention. That's going to have some interesting implications in terms of the economics. as advertisers get more and more data, I think it's going to be important for publishers to realize that they need the same kinds of tools and technology so they can monetize accordingly. So instead of having, I mean, ultimately it'll all be an effective CPM, but I think you're going to see a lot of variability in terms of, okay, what's my likely average viewability percentage for one given exposure? Assuming that the publishers can understand that, that becomes an opportunity for them to monetize, and likewise, I think advertisers will have to absorb the fact that they're going to have to pay higher for that. So I think it's going to get interesting in the sense that we're going to see that kind of interesting sort of dynamics in the video marketplace that have fundamentally not existed in the display marketplace.
All right, good way to end the conversation. Thanks to both you guys. Appreciate it. Okay.